Welcome to the Books Known Only by Title webinar series. I'm Esther Brownsmith, and I am very pleased to be chairing today's session. We're going to be having four speakers. In order, we'll be having Blossom Stefaniw, Daniel Picus, Kim Haines-Eitzen, and Andrew Jacobs. So each person is going to have about 10 minutes to speak. I'll keep an eye on the time, but people have usually been pretty good about that. And then we're going to wait for everyone to give their papers or presentations, and afterwards we'll have a group Q&A. So Matthew Monger is also here doing tech support. Matthew, did you have anything you wanted to say?
Yeah, thanks, Esther. So just basically, if you have problems, I can't fix most of them, but for the Q&A, if you would try to use the Q&A module in Zoom, which you can find by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom screen or wherever you find it, and then writing your question in there, and that way they will stay current until we've addressed them, and I will be sorting through to make sure that they get asked. If you post it in the chat, I will try and catch it, but if there's a lot going on in the chat, I may miss something. So the Q&A will be a little easier to do if you use that. That's it.
All right. Thank you. So before we begin, I'm just going to set the tone by reading the abstract for this session. The past is inaccessible, the archive fallible. Grappling with these realities, the archival turn has called for scholars to move past a model of the archive as innocent deposit of texts and artifacts. Instead, we must contend with its political, affective, gendered, and racialized components, including our own instrumentalizing desire for sovereignty and mastery. How do we imagine or stop imagining the archive as a foreign and feminized space of enticement, concealment, and discovery, penetration and possession? This panel seeks to shift attention not only to critical examination of the archive, but also to how the archive, material or imagined, mediates scholarly and other readerly desires for the past. Both ancient readers and, quote, seminal modern historians have engaged the past through the texts and artifacts they craved, living out that desire in or upon the archive. How are these epistemic, historiographic, and literary desires shaped by gender and race? Which past is the object of desire and which past is scorned? And which subject is the right subject of historical knowledge? The panel will question how scholars past and present have shaped and been shaped by the archives that we explore. In the process, we will consider the future of archival research and scholarly desire, mapping new methods for navigating the contours of history and emotion. And with that, Blossom Stefaniw will begin speaking on affect, mastery, and evasion in the archival imaginary. Blossom.
All right, thank you very much, Esther, and thank you everybody for being here. So as you might expect, what I'm going to talk about tonight is less focused on sort of a specific textual example and more on the scholarly imaginary, on trying to figure out what's going on with the type of affect that tends to pool around the archive and why that is so intense. So I'm going to go ahead and share this slideshow with you now that I have got that set here. Sneak preview. All right. So I have more questions than answers for you today. And the main questions I'm sort of working with are, what do we want from the archive and who wants it? Why is there so much affective charge combined with sketchy behavior pooled around the archive? And what do we do with the involvement of what we might call big archives with programs of mastery? And of course, as you know, there are many different definitions of archives, many different types of archives. But what I'm referring to today are sort of national archives, these giant wealthy institutions, especially in Europe, which grew out of colonialism and related movements in the 18th and 19th centuries. So here are those questions for you. Now, as noted in the webinar abstract, the archival turn, which to my knowledge has not really arrived in theology and religious studies and in the study of late antiquity, that archival turn shifted away from treating the archive as this sort of innocent and unproblematic thing to considering the archive itself, its formation and our relations to it, as a complex and fraught matter that we ought to pay attention to. In other words, just as with the linguistic turn, the fish started to ask some questions about the water, in the archival turn, people who thought they were miners started asking questions about where this mountain came from. So a lot of my examples today are in dialogue with and drawn from Gregory Quechar's excellent 2019 book, which I highly recommend reading. And it is one of the few books in religious studies and theology to kind of work through the archival turn and how it has impacted us. So that archival turn has done a lot to establish that archives are products of specific historical and very, very contingent events and movements. It has established that archives are built in analogy with and in order to make plausible other structures of race and gender and nationalism. And many national archives assert sort of a marvelous totality and comprehension, reflecting the aspirations of empire. So here you can think of the British Library being built and expanding physically as the empire expands. And Quechar describes the British Museum as arising out of sort of this moral duty to intellectually and physically control the world's knowledge, systemizing it according to the natural, and here natural is a code for Western, order of things. But even these big archives, which are highly tendentious and proliferating and make these claims to totality, even those archives are porous, ambiguous, and incomplete. In the Ethnographic Museum of Berlin, for example, only 5% of the holdings have ever been put on exhibit. The rest is just stuff in the basement, uncatalogued or too poorly inventoried to be identified. So it's actually full of objects which in their very inertia reveal the absence of the comprehensive knowledge which colonial archives were supposed to affirm through display. Europeans simply didn't have the right knowledge to identify those objects. So if we're getting ready to talk about affect, I certainly have some feelings about the sort of recalcitrant otherness of those objects who have been resisting categorization for several hundred years. In the same way, any given archive generally holds a large proportion of texts which have evaded the catalog. So these are fugitive pieces which don't match up with any research question, which refuse to mediate contact with the really real or to sort of render up the cold hard facts, which are the object of many archival desires. Which is to say that contrary to how we imagine them and what we so often want from them, archives do hold a lot of random pointless things. So here, this is an extremely bad photograph on my part, but this is from the National Archives in London a few years ago, where I went to try to find out about the Tura find of 1941. And, just like in Catherine Steedman's book, they give you this box full of stuff and it's like nerd Christmas, right? There is this desire and allure and excitement to be able to read things that very few people have read or very few people know about. But what I actually found out was that somebody was looking for his puppy, you know, and I also read the health reports and now know how many soldiers had syphilis at the time of the health inspection. So these revelations do satisfy some sort of epistemic desire. And by telling them to you now, I did just provoke some sort of affect, but I'm not quite sure of the names for those charms and shifts we all just felt. So Quishar just describes how arrangements in the reading museums, and pardon me, these are backwards, in the British Museum made clear the notion of the ideal learner. So who is supposed to be in there reading? That person was supposed to be male, titled, formally educated, employed, a homeowner, well-dressed, respectable, and studious. Now, on this plan, there were separate tables for ladies, which had lady chairs and little stools to put your lady feet on while you did your lady reading, right? And that furniture was a citation of a proper drawing room, showing that, as Quishar states, for women readers, the threshold for knowledge production was never intended to go beyond the drawing room, whereas the expectations for male readers was limitless study and encyclopedic knowledge. Quishar also found, to my great delight, that there were constant complaints in the press about women refusing to stay at the lady tables. And of course, I instantly claimed these women as my ancestors. So in the project here in Oslo, on books known only by title, we see sort of two different pools of scholarly affect which come up in response to encountering a book which is fictional. We see both tenderness and frustration. I, of course, am on team tenderness. I love the fictional books. I love the people who imagined them. And I am glad that they managed to sort of stash part of their impossible but desired knowledge somewhere that it can't ever be retrieved. I adore these fugitive, evasive things and the endless expansion, the open stories and hiddenness involved in doing that. By that, you can tell that I'm not a 19th century gentleman. Team frustration tended to be a 19th century gentleman and to need to resolve the act of evasion with which they were confronted when they encountered a book known only by title. And that was done sometimes by rejecting it as spurious or sort of asserted in bad faith, or it was turned into a real book and put in a book list so that it could resolve. And what you see in both of those moves is sort of scholars closing out. They're either rejecting the author's claims about the book, or they're resolving the matter to make it go away. That's a need for resolution. Now, if the archive were just an innocent deposit of books, there wouldn't be such a lot of affective charge flying around in it. If the archive were merely this unproblematic collection of items from the past, there also would not be so much outrageous behavior, mostly stealing and lying, connected to items included in it or excluded from it. So I'm thinking that with archives, when we see this sort of pooling of outsized affect and half-heartedly masked crime in the terrain of human culture, we're looking at something visceral, something that has been imagined in such a way as to connect it and involve it with survival. So we asked in the webinar abstract about treatment of the archive as a foreign and feminized space of enticement, concealment and discovery, penetration and possession, and about how these epistemic, historiographic, and literary desires are shaped by gender and race. Both gender and race are structured around disruptions of agency and around epistemic erasure. In many of these archival scenes, there is likewise a disruption of agency, there's intrusion, there's a hijacking of other people's stories and their right to tell them. The past cannot speak for itself, but whose past is it? The archive can be the place of strange scenes of plenitude and withholding. And you want to hang on to that issue of male gendered plenitude in the possession of, a comprehensive and complete thing, matched with female gendered withholding, cloistering, being in custody, but also being pressed upon to render up something and to cooperate with one's own possession. So I think as scholars, we are always crossing boundaries when we enter the archive and when we act upon our desires for the past. Even when I requested my own grandfather's files from the Errolson archives, that's what's in this other very poor photograph on my part, but they had to make it blurry for the sake of privacy. Even in looking at a story of which I am a part, I am intrusive because I was not part of it then. Neither the 18-year-old boy who was captured and made a forced laborer in Germany, nor the old man tending his garden in Wisconsin 40, 50 years later, gave me permission to look at his trauma. A certain sense of decency presented me tonight from including a slide of his ID cards issued by the Nazis. But even if I don't show them in public, I do own them now. I'm still the only one in the family able to read them and to follow up the German documents and records necessary to give them context, which is to say, I have power that a grandchild should not have. I have power over the memory and identity and story of another human being. And I'm telling you this because genealogy is always implicit in our relation to the archive. Whether we imagine ourselves as descendants of ancestors from the same religious tradition or the same geographical area, or even as modern scholars identifying with our learned ancient counterparts, a reversal of power relations between elders and offspring is always in play. Ranke described history as the science of penetrating. Now, I don't know the right way to want the past. I don't know who should be telling each story. What I can tell you is that I continue to be curious about the affective world surrounding the archive. And I have more questions about how that works in connection with religion and especially the Christian past. I would like to see scholars letting go of a patriarchal imaginary in which desire means possession and connection is only achieved through penetration. If we surrender claims to mastery and possession of the past, we are also surrendering to a world in which we are always wrong. We relinquish a scholarly subjectivity which amounts to impersonation of the imperial knower, and we start learning in the way of migrants and fugitives, like people who build homes in worlds where things are askew, where numerous stories mix in unpredictable ways, and where desires for order can settle down alongside a fondness for what we cannot have. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Blossom. That was fantastic. Do you mind unsharing your screen?
Yep, my mouse is invisible, but I will try it. There we go.
Beautiful. And next we have Daniel Picus speaking on anthologies in the archive. Daniel.
All right, let me share my screen. I've only got 3 slides, and this one is up for a bunch of the time, so I apologize for how boring that is. And this is more of a, I'm trying to track almost a stream of consciousness of what questions about desire and archives sort of instigated for me. And thank you to the organizers, really, for giving me that opportunity to do that. The archive is unstable in a variety of ways. It's ever growing. Not only does it consistently expand with the study and discovery of new documents, new texts, new editions, new material, but it also expands with the very scholars who work within it. As a scholar of late antique rabbinic Judaism, I'm familiar with a particular archive, the Archive of Classical Rabbinic Literature, which I think we could easily call an imagined archive. But fascinatingly, this is an archive that is composed, as of course all archives are, of a unique sort of set of texts. And in the case of my archive, these texts are mostly anthologies. So when asked to think about the archive in my work, I find myself really slipping from the archive to the anthology. I think these are related ideas, but after trying really hard to constrain myself to the archive and getting nowhere, I ultimately decided to think a little bit about what it means for the archive I'm most familiar with to be populated substantially by anthologies. And I here try to think about how the anthology shapes its readers, leaving open questions about how the archive and the anthologies within it might shape scholars, and how the tension and slippage between the two is maybe something we need to be particularly attentive to. The anthology, I think, provides us with some flexibility that the idea of the archive could sometimes obscure. And there's a productive tension in thinking about what the place of the anthology might be in our understanding of the archive as our source for the past. The anthology is a natural starting place, as I said, for those of us who study classical rabbinic literature. For years now, it's been second nature to refer to texts like the Midrashim and the Talmuds as compilations, and to think about their creation in terms that span orality, collection, redaction, and editing in multiple layers, and to be willing to both look for overarching trends within a text or between certain texts, while at the same time willingly admitting that because of its anthological nature, the anthology as a document might in multiple places contradict itself and even refer to itself. This is not unique to the study of rabbinic literature. Many of these discussions are mirrored in the study of the Hebrew Bible and classics in a variety of other fields. Although I think it is important to note that David Stern, for example, has commented that the anthology could be the oldest literary genre in Judaism, which is a sort of fabulous paradox that I find really wonderful. Stern identifies what he calls the anthological habit as, quote, the tendency of gathering together discrete, sometimes conflicting retellings of stories or traditions and preserving them side by side as though there were no difference, conflict, or ambiguity between them, end quote. Stern, while one of the first to try and theorize the anthology in Jewish studies, was hardly the last, but his starting points are really clear stepping stones for beginning an inquiry. I'll try to touch on some of his more theoretical contributions to the study of the anthology with reference to a particular text I've worked on, Lamentations Rabbah. Thinking about Lamentations Rabbah as an anthology that resides in the archive or as part of the archive provides us with a little more fodder for thinking about the archival habit, both our own habits in the archive and the habits that made the archive what it was, to the extent, of course, that we can ever truly separate the two. I claim no real pure innovation here, but rather I took the opportunity raised by a provocative series of questions provided by the organizers to think through some of the mental scaffolding that holds my own understanding of my field in place, and to formulate some questions from that. Lamentations, or Echa Rabbah, is a late ancient rabbinic collection of midrash. It's likely Palestinian, dated from, as with many of these, from the 4th, 5th centuries. It is anthological, like most rabbinic texts, and as an element in the classical rabbinic archive, Its contents are, to some degree, overlapping with other Palestinian rabbinic texts, such as Genesis Rabbah and the Palestinian Talmud. It exists in two main versions. The first, published in Pesaro in 1519 by the Soncino family, is the more widely available version, but another edition was printed in 1899 by Solomon Buber in Vilna. The more recent, the Buber edition, is often considered to be the inferior text, a designation that comes from our own desires to use the archive as a tool for uncovering an unadulterated past. The contents of Lamentations Rabbah skew towards the narrative. Galit Chazan Rokem, one of the scholars who's made a great study of it, has found much in this anthology to enrich our understanding of Jewish life in late ancient Palestine. The stories, tales, and interpretations present therein tend towards the everyday and are all set against a backdrop of tragedy, as the biblical Book of Lamentations responds to the destruction of the first temple by the Babylonians. Lamentations Rabbah thematizes the destruction of the second, and indeed in some places the first. Even in tales where destruction and tragedy aren't immediately present, the very organization and format of the text involves them. To make a material metaphor, in Lamentations Rabbah, the front cover is the first temple's destruction and the back is the second's. The lives lived in their wake make up the pages. The presence of the temple's destruction in Lamentations Rabbah exemplifies one of Stern's points about the anthology. He says that anthologies can be either implicit or explicit. They can identify themselves as anthologies or simply present themselves neutrally and need to be uncovered as anthologies. I'd like to add, I think, that many anthologies, this one included, kind of fall on a spectrum somewhere in between. Anthologies can be accidental, which is a label that I find compelling. And Lamentations Rabbah, while maybe not accidental, is certainly the sort of anthology that straddles the line here. The text is divided into two clearly delineated portions. The first involves a series of homiletic exegeses, known as ptichta'ot, which connect far-flung verses together through a series of hermeneutic gymnastics until a target verse, in the case of Lamentations Rabbah, Lamentations 1:1, is reached. The latter portion of the text moves more narratively through Lamentations, its organizational logic self-evident. Verses from Lamentations are presented, followed by a series of interpretive passages, followed by the next verse to be exegeted, and we might call this style of commentary lemmatic. Taken as a whole, this text is messy. There are places where an editorial hand is blazingly evident, and other places where that same hand either exhibits a much lighter touch or perhaps no touch at all. The adjacency of two distinct formats, both stylized, but one closer to poetry, the other closer to what we think of as commentary, at times feels disjointed. To read the text straight through, arguably a reading practice that the compilers never intended, is to be plunged into a confusing array of styles, formats, and language. Still, though, the anthology works, and I think this is where it becomes helpful to think with it. I don't just mean that it coheres in certain ways, although it does. I mean that the anthology does work on the reader, and in thinking about it in this way, we're perhaps better positioned to think about the work that the archive does on the scholar, not just on our ideas and desires about the past, but on us as we desire to know and understand that past. So I'll offer a very brief example from the text before concluding. I use as a test case a cycle of 10 stories that appear in the first chapter of Lamentations Rabbah. They are a clear unit. 4 of the stories end with a citation of Lamentations 1:16, which begins, "Over these things I weep, al ela ani bochia." Themes of sorrow, loss, and grief run through all of these stories, as well as themes of subjectivity, oscillating between the personal, the collective, and the gendered. The stories function individually and as a unit, and more than many other rabbinic compositions, they allow us really to see the work of the editor in action. I, of course, won't describe all these in detail. I've left the briefest of outlines up here. The important thing is that while there are thematic threads that unite them, there's also an editorial layer by which 4 of these stories have been ended with citations of Lamentations 1:16, "Over these things I weep." 4 stories are authorized with this divine coda, with either a divine voice shouting from heaven over these things I weep, or a prophetic voice, a bat kol. So there's a lot to discuss in these 10 stories, or even one of these stories, but of course we're concerned with their place within the anthology and that anthology's place in the archive. The work that the stories do, I think, become visible when we begin to consider the anthology as a text that was used, rather than just a static collection. But of course, the question of how it was used remains elusive, and I really make no pretense to answer that definitively here. The form and content of Lamentations Rabbah echoes the liturgical calendar of the Jewish year surrounding the 9th of Av, commencing with the reading of the Book of Lamentations on the day that commemorates the temple's destruction, the 9th of Av, and then proceeding over the course of the next 2 weeks, a period of time that traditionally ends with the Lunar New Year, in the Jewish lectionary calendar, sort of coalescing around the same time as Lamentations Rabbah, 7 selections from the prophetic books, all of them exhortations of reconciliation and comfort, would be read along with the regular lectionary from the Torah. The advent of this lectionary is, as I said, roughly concurrent with the composition of Lamentations Rabbah, although with all things involving rabbinic practice, this is less secure than we'd like. So in the liturgical calendar, we have the sort of reading of Lamentations, grief, and then these 7 weeks of comfort. That comfort is absent in Lamentations Rabbah. The comfort that the prophetic readings provide in the lived community is not made explicit in the rabbinic anthology. It's only through continued participation in a communal practice of reading and prayer that an individual can ultimately reconcile these uncomfortable tensions and griefs that populate the text. Our anthology echoes this tension, but its editing, by which certain moments of grief, the 4 that I've marked here with the citations of 116, are divinely authorized through the citation of yet another text, echoes this liturgical cycle of mourning, reconciliation, and comfort. The text is effective because it follows a narrative pattern, or a series of narrative patterns, of obviously rising tension. It is signposted with biblical verses, and continually reminds the readers that this is a moment of lamentation with the invocation of 116. So what it feels like to me is that the crafting of the liturgy in a text like Lamentations Rabbah reflect an understanding of how people are expected to encounter certain texts, but maybe even outside of the texts themselves, meant to encounter communities and liturgies. And I think this understanding is possible because a text like Lamentations Rabbah is an anthology, consciously edited, but also a repository, formatted and organized, but also unstable, dynamic in content, but consistent in temperament, composed, but of course, authorless. Lamentations Rabbah, rabbinic as it is, does not hold its secrets so close that only a seasoned rabbinic reader could access them, rather encountered in concert with an annual liturgy that emphasizes lamentation, commemoration, and reconciliation, the text becomes a liturgy of its own. So then what of the archive? Does including an anthology, or indeed an entire array of anthological texts within the archive, tell us something different? I'd argue that it does, as texts that wear their composition and fragility perhaps a little bit more openly on their sleeves, but also obscure such things a little more obviously. An anthology, if we know how to read it, can illuminate corners of the archive that a more uniform and unified text might not. In these corners, we might not see texts or names or faces that we might not otherwise have recognized, but we can, I think, catch glimpses of the practices and rhythms that might have bound groups together, or the meters of lives lived just beyond the edges of the texts that the archive otherwise contains. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was so interesting. Next, we have Kim Haines-Eitzen, who's speaking on woodland archives. So Kim.
Hi, great to be with you all. I don't have a PowerPoint, but I do have some scenes and images, and I'll let your imagination depict them. Just over a year ago, on March 13th, 2020, My university, my town, and my state shut down. Dormitories closed, students were sent home, faculty and staff told to work remotely. Everyone was to shelter in place, go into lockdown, stay home. As COVID-19 began to spread throughout New York State, libraries, museums, manuscript and rare book collections, archives, all closed their doors. Days turned into weeks and even months of closures, forcing us to reckon with questions about access, equity, knowledge, even truth. When the archives are closed, what is a historian to do? I went into the woods. In the rural hamlet where I live, expanses of fields and meadows are surrounded by forests and overgrown pastures. In these woodlands, I found archives of another sort. So here is the scene I found in the woods. Truth sits in a metal chair, smoking a cigarette and drinking Pabst Blue Ribbon. She waits where the silent and overgrown clearing, once called the graveyard or the horse pasture, bides by railroad ruins, tracks unzipped and carted away some 80 years ago. Above old roots, beyond vines and brambles, she can sometimes hear the faint echo of the train's whistle and feel the earth rattling. And overhead, the twisting apple tree still blooms each spring, shading the rusted chassis, once glossy Mercedes, that now slump under the weight of snow and remorse. The neighbor says these forest relics belong to a distant relative who planned one day to restore them. Safekeeping, I guess. Or that perhaps they were left here to decay, just out of sight from the homes down the hill, once their scrap metal had been stripped and sold. But truth tells it otherwise. They were put out to pasture with the horses, she says, and from their vinyl seats, young men watched for the train and plotted their futures. The cars still face the railroad bed, and the doors gape wide, as though those boys flew slingshotted in holy terror. In their introduction to Ruin Memories, Materialities, Aesthetics, and the Archaeology of the Recent Past, Björnar Olsen and Thora Pettersdottir argue that the modern ruins, like those I found in the woods, continue to be, quote, mainly considered as an environmental and aesthetic disturbance, representing a dismal and unwanted presence to be eradicated or transformed, rather than something to be considered, cared for, or accepted, end quote. Indeed, I found myself asking, who would leave these cars and furniture, broken glass and beer cans, detritus of former lives in these quiet and lush woods? Why trash the woods? And yet I couldn't deny the affective potency of objects strewn about, the residues left behind, and my own desire to understand the past. I kept returning to the same woods. As the poet Louise Glick writes, human beings leave signs of feeling everywhere. The sense of dashed dreams was palpable in the woods last spring as the world went silent. I began to excavate some of the items in my woods to bring back to my writing studio broken headlights, rusted beer cans, shards of rubber, chrome, and glass to photograph them. I felt keenly the need to document my finds, to identify the date, age, and type of each object, to catalog and classify the garbage, to extricate it, exhume it from its context, its partial burial, so that I could somehow see it better, and I could encounter those who used to live here. Scrolls from the Qumran caves, codices from Nag Hammadi, Dishna, or Tura, papyrus fragments from trash heaps at Oxyrhynchus. We extract these textual objects in our quest for the past. We arrange them in libraries and archives, classify and catalog them, study and write about them, explain our knowledge of them. Meanwhile, the landscapes that afforded their preservation are disrupted. Could we say disemboweled? As the texts are displaced and moved into sterile spaces. What happens when we put books and ancient textual archives into conversation with other things, with the lives of other objects? Can modern ruins teach us about our own desire for the past, our longings for the archive that seems to open the door to the past? With Doug Anderson, I would argue that, quote, things do not speak with the distinctness of a statement. If we want to see things in their own light, we must acknowledge the fact that they always meet us in the realm between revelation and concealment, end quote. Our desires for the past are necessarily and inevitably bound to the landscapes of things, to the places where objects, environment, and memory braid themselves together. To return to Olson and Pettisdottir, quote, through processes of abandonment and ruination, modern ruins also importantly recall the very mode in which they and we remember, and indeed the very nature of memory itself. That is, by being fragmented, broken, and disordered, they do not shun, but commemorate the unique characteristics of all memory, including its incompleteness. That memory does not so much depend on the completeness of things left behind as on their thoroughly crafted and rough outlines, on their worn surfaces, on their very scars and absences, on mold, rust, and fragmentation. We need to confront, they say, things here and now, where and as they show themselves, in their untamed bonding, as palimpsests of hybrid assemblages of artifacts, stone, bones, and soil mixed together. We have made significant strides, I think, in regarding ancient books, papyrus fragments, and bureaucratic documents as physical objects rather than just texts. But there is more to do. We map our desires for the past, our quest for knowledge, onto the archive, imagined or real. The archive as storehouse implies closure, curation, preservation, even sterility. The archive, but the world of the objects, the book, the document, the fragment, rusted ruins, shards, never fails to imprint itself on us, our desires and our imaginations. It has a kind of intrusiveness that disrupts. The archive as a storehouse of ruins may, in the end, teach us about deeply fragmentary nature of knowledge and the multiple ways in which things resist and frustrate our longings for the past. In the time I have remaining, I want to consider briefly another example of an archive, the archive of sound. To some extent, the soundscapes of the woodlands where I found recent ruins can be considered an acoustic archive of sorts, an ephemeral, fleeting, and changeable archive, a collection of seasonal, regional, environmental sounds. With the 19th century invention of recording technologies, the phonograph cylinder, for example, sound archives were created to collect and preserve recordings of the human voice, music, cityscapes, and animal communications. As some of you know, in recent years, as part of my work on desert sounds and late ancient Christian monasticism, I have begun making my own field recordings in desert environments. These recordings are not intended to directly reflect, record, or mirror the desert sounds we find represented in monastic literature. Rather, they evoke, they call forth an acoustical register that is largely lost to us. Where is sound in the archives of antiquity? Where can we hear the voices that read the texts we now exhume, decipher, catalog, and interpret? Where are the sounds of the Nile, the sounds of the Alexandrian streets, the sounds of the Oxyrhynchus garbage dumps or the Keturah quarries? Is it possible to recover those sounds, even if only in our imagination? And what might it mean for us to think of our fragmentary texts not only lying next to other objects, a bone, a fishhook, a reed pen, but also existing within a sounding world, a sensory and sensational landscape where voice and industry, labor and nature, procession and games merged to form a full animate life. When we extract the textual residue of the past, the words inscribed on papyrus or parchment or ceramic, from their embedded and embodied existence in the world of things, and the sensational landscape of antiquity, how might we be further fragmenting and distorting our already partial and biased desire for the past? Thank you.
Thank you. That was incredible. Finally, we have Andrew Jacobs, who will be speaking on gospel thrillers, fear and desire in a fictional archive.
I believe I have to follow those papers, but oh well, here goes. Are we all seeing my screen? Great. So thank you to the Only by Title team for having me here today. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. And if anyone from the audience wants these slides afterwards, feel free to reach out to me. I'm going to go through, not super quickly, but there might be some images that aren't particularly clear, but my email is on there, andrew@andrewjacobs.org. So let's dive in. In the 1970 novel, The Dead Sea Cipher by Elizabeth Peters, which was the nom de plume of Egyptologist Barbara Mertz, the heroine, a young woman on a tour of Holy Land sites, finds this scrap of paper that you see on the screen with a mysterious set of numbers and letters like 2QMICB and 1QOBA and 1QEXZ. It must be a code, our heroine posits. Later, an archaeologist explains to her what most of you in the audience probably already know, that these are Dead Sea Scrolls notations, the number of a cave at Wadi Qumran, Q or Wadi Muraba'at, M, followed by the abbreviated name of a biblical text and a lowercase letter if it's one fragment of several. The first is probably a fragment of Micah, followed by Obadiah, Hosea, Amos, and later we can see Chronicles, Exodus, Nehemiah. But we might ask, what is MAT? What is VIR? And then the last item on the list. This concept, Peters writes, was so monumental to her that her mind reeled under the impact of it. A second fragment of the life of Jesus. Dead Sea Cipher is an early example of a genre of novel that I've been studying and want to introduce in the discussion of ancient books known only by title. I call these novels gospel thrillers. They're mostly English language US novels about a newly discovered or rumored first century gospel whose contents will upend our knowledge of Christian origins. The hero seeks the truth, shadowy forces try to stop him, and there's a dangerous race against time. This plot probably sounds familiar, a lot like The Da Vinci Code by Dan Brown, the 2003 novel, 2006 movie, which also relied on biblical and parabiblical codes and conspiracies, but gospel thrillers are crucially different. They imagine a totally new and unknown gospel rather than relying on interpretation of already known scrolls or apocrypha. The dozens of gospel thrillers that have appeared from the 1960s to the 2020s provide us with a fantasy archive of ancient texts that have never existed except between the pages of a novel. They're sometimes imagined as forgeries, sometimes as lost, sometimes, as in Peter's novel, only ever known by title. These novels imagine the Bible as we have it as a product of suppression and conspiracy. Their lost gospels threaten to disclose that suppression and reveal a new truth. But in reading these novels, I've been struck at how the fantasy archive of the gospel thrillers acts as much to contain desire for new truths as it does to provoke them. Dead Sea Cipher is a clear example of this. The mysterious scrolls, including 1Q El-Jez B and 1Q Vera A, A Life of a Virgin, are destroyed before anyone can ever read them. Perhaps they would have revealed shocking secrets. Perhaps they would have conformed Orthodox teachings. Another gospel thriller that I want to look at more closely can show us how these novels push and constrain the hidden desires of the fantasy archive of lost gospels. The Word by Irving Wallace is by far the most successful of the gospel thrillers. Published in 1972, it remained one of the best-selling books of the year and was made into a CBS miniseries in 1978. Wallace was a very successful, if not particularly critically respected author who made a name with sensational and risque novels marketed to a mass public. I had the very good fortune to work in Wallace's literary archives, which are held by the Claremont College's Special Collections Library. So I want to use Wallace's material archive on the Word to trace the limits of the fantasy archive of the gospel thrillers. Wallace conceived of the Word around 1961. A two-page document from May of that year already had the title and various ideas about the contents of the gospel, how it's found, and main characters. A lot of these details would wind up changed. Wallace does, however, already have a clear sense of how the novel would end. Although the hero proves the new gospel is a forgery, it is nonetheless published and, as it says here, is quoted in sermons, and it makes men happy like all religion and doesn't matter. That denouement remains unchanged over the next decade, while other details were much more in flux. So as originally conceived, the gospel would be fragments found in old manuscripts of the 2nd century Bible found in Egypt. It would recount that Christ went to Rome and that he was not a carpenter, and it would discuss how he looked, how he lived in Egypt, and his brother James. There is nothing yet about the content, however, that would make men happy. Over the course of the decade, especially once Wallace dedicated himself to writing the Word later in the 1960s, he took various stabs at fleshing out the content of this new gospel. So at one point, he lists in bullet points several ideas gleaned from his research: how Jesus looked and was raised, expansion of his revelation and work, 2 apostles defected, how the wrath of Judas really was incurred, 40 days explained in line, temptation defined, 2 added miracles, perhaps travels not known before, some weaknesses of the Lord, reference to actual habits, several exact dates given. Wallace is still notably very vague. How, expansion, perhaps, are place fillers for whatever the content of this lost gospel will be. By the time he's writing in the 1970s, he starts to get a little more adventurous. So in notes from April 13th, 1970, he writes, and I just have to move this little thing on my screen, new discovery will prove Jesus is relevant today, a young rebel who preached a new social order and utopia on earth, which suits what is going on right now. Conveniently approved of divorce, disapproved of celibacy for all the clergy, approved of abortion, equality between sexes, approved of blacks and browns and yellows as one with the whites. Jesus traveled widely in lost years, from Palestine to Rome to near and far east, including India and possibly China, all broad and in need of interpretation. Yet just 2 months later, there we go, these ambitions have receded. In a letter to his local research assistants in June of that year, Wallace bemoans the real problem, which I will soon have to face, and then in a handwritten marginal note, what is the discovery? I keep changing it around. He rattles off on this long list here that I'm not going to go through. It's about 15 different items, several different possibilities, none of which touch on the sexual and racial utopianism of his April list. More about Jesus's profession, travels, and you'll note the Far East and India are now deemed too exotic. Age, family relations, some vague references to apocryphal texts. Wallace is also still trying to decide the source of his new gospel. Is it James, Paul, some likely Roman writer on the scene? Wallace eventually decides on a Gospel of James, which is also the hypothetical source document Q. He also throws in a brief account of Jesus's trial in Greek by Pontius Pilate. The Gospel of James/Q recounts Jesus's life, including, as envisioned already in 1961, a physical description and travels to Rome, although here the travels to Rome now happen after his first crucifixion in Jerusalem, which has become instead a near-death experience. Wallace also leaned heavily into Jesus's Jewish background. He studies with the Essenes at Qumran, with Pharisees and priests in Jerusalem. He undergoes a bar mitzvah and a confirmation. His condemnation by Pilate is entirely engineered by Romans, and the Jews are exculpated. And here is a summary of the teachings in James Q. James had set down numerous sayings of his brother Jesus that had uncanny relevance to the world today, sayings concerning the exploitation of the poor by the wealthy and the ruling class, sayings concerning the need for a compact among nations to end war and colonialism, sayings on the necessity of education for all, sayings that disapproved of superstition, dogma, ritual, and 2 sayings that actually prophesied that one day men would stride the planets of heaven at a time when the earth verged on self-destruction. Jesus's teachings in the New Gospel retain a sense of utopianism suited to the Vietnam War era. These themes are obviously, however, much more muted than the pro-choice, post-racial Jesus whom Wallace flirted with just a year before. So what can we learn from this brief dip into Wallace's literary archives about our fantasy archive of lost gospels? The new gospel in most gospel thrillers ends up fiddling at the margins of biblical revelation like the word does. In some of them, Peter was a jerk, Paul was a Roman agent, Jesus was a military revolutionary, he was a cynic philosopher, a liberation theologian, a or the teacher of righteousness. Some gospel thrillers do venture a little further. Jesus didn't really die or didn't really rise from the dead after his crucifixion. Jesus got married and had children. Jesus taught that women could be ministers. The gospel in one 1980s novel inspired by popular literature on Gnostic gospels reveals the Messiah was actually a woman. Jesus was her foundling foster brother, to whom she gave credit for her teachings and miracles. But Wallace's decade-long vacillation is more representative of the general timidity of the gospel thrillers. Even in the fantasy archive, some lines are too scary or maybe even too unprofitable to cross. Let me conclude by linking the fears and desires of this fictional fantasy archive with analogous fears and desires in the fantasy archive of scholars. Much of the Wallace archive, which he put together before giving it to the Carolina colleges, is filled with notes of his research on biblical history and publishing, much of which he drops in large, undigested chunks into the novel, like 3 pages on radiocarbon dating. In interviews at the time of publication, he bragged about the extent of his reading, travel, and interviews. But in a short document that he put together in 1983 to accompany his archive, he acknowledged the various research assistants, all of them women, he hired across the world to visit sites and interview experts. Marika Hudson was married to an old friend of Wallace's who lived in Paris, and she conducted many interviews and site visits in Europe. In Paris, she interviewed Maurice Carré, André Dupont-Sommet, Cardinal Jean Danielou, and Henri-Irénée Marou. One of the dozen or so questions Wallace instructed her to ask them all was, what would be the most useful new information, both for scholars and for believers, about Jesus? Marou's answer, which is on the page here, is telling, I don't have enough imagination for that. On the one hand, Marou's refusal to speculate licenses Wallace's own imagination to fantasize new information about Jesus. Wallace is, after all, in the imagination business. On the other hand, Marou's refusal to dream along with Wallace in that fantasy archive could temper Wallace's imagination. If one of the greatest experts in Europe can't imagine an exciting new truth about Jesus, what could Wallace dream up that would be believable? The writers of gospel thrillers draw their aspirational energy from biblical studies, which places the Bible in a constant state of revision, retranslation, and reinterpretation. But at the same time, they imbibe and reproduce the Guild's fear of the Bible's vulnerability, should that revision, retranslation, and reinterpretation fall into the wrong hands. The result is a fantasy archive that's always curbing its own possibilities and potential. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. That was wonderful. So now is the time for folks to get your questions into the Q&A. So please feel free to add them there. And in the meantime, while folks put together their thoughts and type up their questions, I wanted to give the people on the panel a chance, if any of you have questions for each other or wanted to respond to any of the other talks. Anyone?
I would just say, Blossom, in your talk, I have written down so many phrases that I'm going to come back to, like the fugitive objects. I'm thinking now of objects that escape. Nerd Christmas was fantastic. There was a lot for us to think about in terms of our desire and genealogy, of course, the way in which that's implicated. But it was great to hear Daniel and Andrew too, and really rich for me.
Thank you, Kim. That's very kind. I was trying very hard not to do a Meryl Streep at the Oscars and just like get up out of my seat and start yelling. But yeah, Snow and Remorse. That's definitely stuck in my head too. And I wish so much we could have had you here in Oslo.
So we do have a question that's come in. So this is from Laura Carlson Hassler, and she says, this is a bit tangential, but I actually have a pedagogical question for everyone, but especially for Dr. Stefaniw. I wonder if you have thought about our own implication in archive trouble as agents of the university, not only as scholars, but also as teachers, as we perhaps try to cultivate a desire to know about the past in our students. How do we create skepticism in our students about what our archives actually afford, and awareness of the imperialism that these portals to the past so often always bring with them? Wow.
That's a great question. And this is a good moment to give Ancient Jew Review a shout out. And Daniel Picus is one of the fabulous editors there. There is actually a pedagogical archive, a pedagogical exercise on there called Archive Trouble, where I had students sort of produce a problematic archive by accident, and then decided we should stick with that. So you can look at that for a practical exercise, but I found that this generation of student is extremely receptive and curious about questions to do with how did we get the stuff we had? Because, you know, these issues of like Vice News has a thing on provenance. You know, these questions are in popular discourse and are available to the broader community. So, but you're absolutely right to connect that problem to pedagogy.
I can follow up on that. I don't have a proper answer, but I just want to acknowledge that this is actually something that came up for me as I'm sort of thinking about Lamentations Rabbah, right? Part of this project is focusing less on the composition of the text and more on, okay, so the text is here, what does it or did it do? And then, you know, with that question, there always comes, okay, well, is it doing something to me? And is that a thing that it could have done in the past? And I will sort of freely admit I don't have a good, as probably was clear in my talk, I don't have a good response or a good outlet for those questions, other than trying to acknowledge them. Because of course, these things that we study, recognizing that they are in some ways, they have lives of their own, and acknowledging that we are often tangential to that and therefore affected by that is an important thing to keep in mind, not a thing I know how to correct for.
Thank you. Andrew or Kim, did you want to weigh in on that?
Well, I would echo what Blossom said in terms of my sense of this current generation of students that seem keen to understand not only the ancient past, but how we got to our modern versions of the ancient past. And I'm sure we all, you know, in the classroom have various exercises to sort of take students through ways of meddling with our objects, you know, manipulating the things that we think we depend on, and what does it mean when it's partial and fragmentary, and to what is even the process of reconstruction? What does that look like? And what are the implications of that? Yeah, I think it's important.
Thank you. Matthew, do we have any other questions?
Yeah, so there's also just a question for Kim, if you could share the name of the book that you mentioned by Olsen and Pettersdotter, was it? For those of us who didn't catch it entirely.
So this is my recent, the volume that I've been, you know, poring over. It's called Ruined Memories, Materialities, Aesthetics, and the Archaeology of the Recent Past. So Ruined Memories, it's Routledge, fairly recent, 2018, 19, oh, a little bit older, 2014. It's recent for me.
Great. I actually have a question of my own, if that's all right. So I was really struck by your comment, Kim, about how the recordings that you're making do not reflect or record, they evoke. And so I was wondering, this seems relevant really to any of the four of you. What is our role as scholars in evoking the past, and especially in evoking the pasts that aren't recorded?
Yeah, I think about that a lot. I mean, what does it mean that we are somehow giving voice to the past, or we're calling it out? We take these objects or texts, and often we take the texts, you know, completely isolated from the objects on which they're located. I don't know that I have a good a good response to that, except that I guess I would come back to maybe Blossom's word tenderness, maybe the word empathy, that part of our goal, a part of our responsibility as historians on one level is to recover something of an empathy, and to be sensitive to the ways in which we manipulate that. And I do think about it a lot when I am making recordings and then putting them together in an archive and thinking, okay, well, what have I just done? I've extracted something. Yeah.
Anyone else want to reflect on that? Or you can also move. I think we have a question in chat, Matthew.
Yeah, so Nikki Clements, first thanks you all and appreciates the critical attention that you bring as historians to the archives, and wonders if you all might reflect on the need for theoretical training with attention to power, disparities, construction of knowledge, and that sort of thing, alongside technical training, like in languages and processes. So I think pretty much all of you would have something to say on that, maybe.
I mean, I'll just throw in this because, you know, as Blossom said, we in antiquity rarely actually work with what historians would call archives. So as someone who is married to a quote unquote real historian who actually has archives, right? Like compared to someone who works in the 19th or 20th century, we have nothing, which frees us up a lot, right? We can be evocative and imaginative in ways that professionally modern historians are constrained, because what they have to do is find something in an archive that has not yet been put together and studied as a body. So when I actually went into an archive, it was sort of weird and I didn't know what I was doing and I lost stuff and I had to learn how to keep track of things. It was just a sort of weird clown show of me like dealing with stuff. But also, it was so obviously constructed. I mean, this is literally constructed by the author. He donated his archives to the Claremont colleges, and he put it together to the point where there was accidentally a box they found that he clearly didn't mean to give, because it was correspondence that he had stripped out of the correspondence he included, very personal stuff with one of these women he hired who was in New York, and she was writing him about advice about a friend who was having an affair, and she was a writer and could give advice. And so, I mean, it was obviously very constructed. And I thought, what do I do with that? Would I ever want to use this very private letter from this woman who is still alive? I sort of know who she is. I have information on her. I could figure out who she was. Or, like Blossom was saying, what are the ethical responsibilities? I think the theoretical stuff is almost a little easier for us because we spend so much time not in an archive that we learn how to think theoretically. But ethically, right? It's such a new opportunity to have to think ethically about what historical work is, in a way that maybe we should be reflecting backwards. Just the fact that someone was alive 100 years ago or 50 years ago, is that different from someone alive 1700 years ago? What are our obligations, if anything, to the people whose remains we are going over. I feel like that's something that's much harder to convey, but maybe much more pressing. I'd like to hear what maybe other people think about that.
Yeah, I mean, Nikki, I would absolutely advocate for a strong theoretical training for students, and the way that hooks together with technical training. Like colleagues who are now working with manuscript studies and manuscript traditions. I'm thinking of Ling Ingeborg Lied, I'm thinking of Hugo Lundhaug, I'm thinking of Greg Given and numerous others. And, I'm very bad at remembering names quickly. But in that kind of work, we're seeing, on the one hand, how you have the technical thing hooking together with theoretical problems. Or like if you go and read the discussion going on now about the Benin bronzes, right? You see all the things we learn in theoretical training playing out in a public dialogue. But to go back to the manuscript studies discussions, that's where you are sort of studying the 19th century and the 20th century, because you're studying where we got the manuscripts and where we got the shape in which they have come to us. So it's a bigger archive, and at the same time a production of our imagined archive of the past. So to like handle that without your brain exploding, you have to like do some theoretical work about philosophy going on right now about time, about how we map our relation to time and to the past, about materiality. And there are really a lot of exciting and useful things going on in philosophy and cultural studies that are needed for this. I mean, like Achille Mbembe has I think it's 2002, an essay on the archivist temple. And I don't know why religious scholars haven't just gone berserk over that by now, but we are sometimes not just needing theoretical training, but we're needing a more expansive relationship with scholars from other fields.
I can also contribute, although full disclosure, Nikki and I, who asked the question, we were trained together. But I think one of the most perhaps eye-opening sort of features of that training for me was to be in a program with people whose main interest, or whose sort of driving interest, was ethics, right? And not sort of ethics in the sense of, well, what were ethics in the past? What is the idea of Jewish ethics, or studying Nicomachean ethics? But really like thinking about ethics, as they should be, right? As lived and sort of important ways for living with other people. This is a religious studies department. My undergraduate degree was not in religious studies. So there's sort of a lot of reasons why that came to me as a thing that I really had to square, to sort of square into my understanding of what religious studies was. And this is also not the case in other programs that focus on ancient religion. But I think that to some degree, it also kind of reflects back to Esther's question, right? About how do we sort of, the question of ethically reconstructing the past, and the way that those ethics should inform, or even just sort of be part of, right, what we understand the theoretical scaffolding to be.
Thank you. Unfortunately, I see that, first of all, if you haven't been looking at the chat, there have been some great posts, including a link to a conference around this theme, so definitely check those out. Unfortunately, we are out of time, so I'm going to have to close this up. Our next Books Known Only by Title seminar is actually in just 2 weeks. It's not a month away, so be sure to keep an eye out for that. It's on unsent letters. So thank you so much to all the panelists for a wonderful session. Thank you to Matthew for helping, and to Mariana and Livingeborg for being the leaders of this incredibly fruitful group. So thank you, and have a lovely day, night, morning, afternoon, wherever you are. Thank you.